Hey, Cookies here. We're going to go over how to heal Necrotic Wake and all the important abilities from mobs that you should be concerned about as a healer. So, first up, we have. I guess I should preface this video with this is on an explosive week, so, like, especially on this first pull, my camera angle is going to be super awkward because I need to see all the explosives. So, for one, you can ignore the explosives that are on screen, and two, after this first pull, it's a lot easier to digest the information and stuff and see what's going on. It's just this first pull where like the explosives are really chaotic, so bear with me on this first one, but I'll still explain things as we move along. So after my camera gets fixed here in a second, because I'm going to move it very awkwardly, the first mob that we're going to talk about is the Corpse Harvester. So the Corpse Harvester, right here, marked with star, they are going to do two primary abilities. They're going to do Throw Flesh, which just targets random players with each cast, and it just does a moderate amount of damage to them. So the way you counteract this as a healer is you just keep people topped up. So just play whack-a-mole. When you see someone take damage, heal them and keep them full health if there's a harvester involved in the pull. The other important ability that they do happens, I think, after I change my camera again and we come back up. It's called Drain Fluids. I guess we can talk about it right here. So what Drain Fluids does is it does an initial cast targeting somebody, and if that's not interrupted, then it will begin to, right here you can see it begins to channel and count down for 4 seconds, and it will stun and deal a heavy amount of damage to whoever it's targeting over that 4 seconds. So here you can see it's targeting the mage. There's the debuff on the mage. He's currently stunned, and he'll be taking damage until we interrupt this ability. The way you just use a regular interrupt, or if you're a healer without an interrupt, you can just use crowd control, knockbacks, displacements, stuns, all that kind of stuff. Any kind of crowd control generally will work to interrupt the drain fluids. So keep in mind for that. And that's it for the harvesters. So the next important mob is going to be the Vanguard, which I target here. So they're going to do three important things. First off, they have a passive ability called Seething Rage. You can't see it on the nameplate because I'm not a Soothe class, but you can see it down here on their unit frame. And what Seething Rage does is just like a infinitely stacking effect that just increases the Vanguard's attack speed and essentially how much damage it does to the tank. So the longer you fight the Vanguard, the more damage it does to the tank. If you're playing a Druid, you can soothe this, so just soothe the Vanguards on cooldown pretty much. And if you have a soothe class in your group, they should also be doing it. But if you notice that it's not being soothed, just be aware that the other way to counteract this without a soothe is just killing the Vanguard as fast as possible so that it doesn't get out of control. Other than this, the Vanguard will do something called Bone Claw, which we'll see here in a second. So here's Bone Claw. It targets the tank and will just hit them for a heavy amount of damage, but as you can see here, it's targeting the monk, and the reason for that is because the tank is out here, out of range of the Vanguard. So if the tank is out of range, or out of melee range, I should say, then the Vanguard will just cast Bone Claw on whoever is closest to him. So be aware of this. If you see the tank kiting and the Vanguard is still alive, heal and top off whoever is closest to the Vanguard because they're going to take a heavy hit. You can see right here, if I play this, the monk literally takes like 95% of his health and damage. So be mindful of that. And then the last thing that the Vanguard does is called Meat Shield, which you saw right there at that last second. I'll just rewind it a little bit. And what Meat Shield does is it does a very fast cast. So we'll watch here. I'll pause it. It's already halfway done casting with me just trying to instant pause it. It's like a 1 second cast time. And then if the cast successfully goes off, which here it does not, we interrupt it. But if it does go off, then it starts like a 4 second channel. And if that channel isn't interrupted, then it just starts gaining a big absorb shield on itself over the 4 second duration channel. So you want to interrupt this as fast as possible so that it doesn't regain a bunch of health, because it's essentially just healing itself with that cast. And that can be a deadly combination with, if you're not soothing it and doing all that stuff. So that is the Vanguards. The next mob we will talk about is the Blight Bags. So I'll just rewind it a little bit to where we have the Blight Bags. So they're hard to see, but they are these little, you can actually see them at the start here, it looks like. Yeah, there's some over here to our left. So you can see one running in. So this is just an example of what they look like, but there's a bunch more that we end up pulling in, but my camera gets all messed up. But essentially all you need to know about them is when they die, they're going to blow up and do they're going to put a disease on everybody in your group. You can dispel it if you have a disease dispel, but you don't need to worry about it too much. The main concern is just be aware that when they die, the whole group, here's the debuff you can see on the party frames, everyone's going to be taking like a light amount of ticking damage. So in combination with other things like the bone claws or the throw flesh like we talked about, it can be deadly because it can lower people just enough to where they take too much damage from the other abilities. So when this happens, just throw down some kind of AoE healing or just be ready to kind of top everybody up with this debuff going. And that's pretty much all the Blight Bags do. And this debuff goes out when they die. It's just when they die, they explode and apply the debuff to everybody. Okay, next up we're going to talk about the boss, because the rest of the packs here that we pull are just regular mobs that we already talked about. So we'll go ahead and skip ahead here a little bit. And then I'm going to skip a little further ahead until we're not fighting a bunch of mobs with the boss. So right about here is probably good. Okay, so this boss has 3 important abilities. The first one being Crunch. This just hits the tank for a moderate amount of damage. Be sure the tank is topped up for every single crunch, and you'll be just fine. And then the next important ability is going to be Heaving Wretch. What Heaving Wretch does is it targets a random player in the group. And then what you're going to need to do is face this away from the group if it's targeting you, and then use a big defensive. Otherwise, if it's targeting somebody else, you want to just keep them very topped up and healthy, and then they will get a disease debuff when this goes off. You can't see it, but you can see it up here in my debuffs. You can't see it on my frame because I can't dispel it, but you can just dispel this disease debuff just to help reduce the amount of damage they take afterwards. And then it's going to spawn these little carrion worms, and you just want to crowd control these and kill them as you continue killing the boss. And then the last ability that the boss does is called Fetid Gas. It's just this right here. The only reason I'm mentioning it, it's literally just get out of the circle, but essentially you don't actually have to get out right away. So what you can see here, I'll kind of slow it down a little bit. As it pops, you saw the circle was way bigger. It was like out to here. But the green puddle is only this small, and it just slowly grows. So you actually don't have to get out of the circle right away. You can stay in there if you're like a melee healer, and just wait until the green puddle on the floor actually starts growing in size, and then you move out. So that's pretty much it for that boss. Just keep everybody topped up. Keep the tank topped up for the crunches, and then just watch out for the Heaving Wretches. So next up we have the Zolramus. What is this? Zolramus Soldiers. Or not soldiers, sorry, Sorcerer. I'm just going to call them the Sorcerers. They're going to cast Necrotic Bolt. It typically targets the tank, and this just applies a healing absorb on the tank, so this needs to be interrupted as much as possible. Otherwise, you just need to keep the tank topped up and heal through the absorb shields. If any of these go off, you'll see the tank. Yeah, you can see right there, it's like this kind of like, and it's on the monk too. It's like this kind of grayish, or this darker color on their class color. That is the absorb shield, so that means I need to heal through that much of their HP before I can actually heal them. So you can almost say that the monk is like at this HP, and this health is kind of irrelevant. And then they also cast Shadow Well, which I will try to play it here so you can see it. You can actually see one on the floor right here. I'm going to try to rewind it so we can see exactly that Shadow Well. It's hard to see if you're not a melee healer, but essentially what Shadow Well does is it's just going to throw down... Where is it at? Should happen right about here. There's the Shadow Well. So you'll watch on the tank, it's going to throw down this little zone on the floor. You can barely see it right there. It's like this dark puddle. If you stand in that, depending on key level, it like can instant kill you if you stand in it. So just don't stand in this. And also what it does is if you're standing in it, you can't receive any healing. So if the tank is inside of it, you can't do any healing to them. But typically people move out pretty quick, but as a melee healer, you just want to be very aware that when Shadow Well casts, you should already be moving out of the way. Don't wait until the puddle spawns. There's another one right there on the floor, right by the Goliath. Don't wait until the puddle spawns. Just get out immediately as you see the cast going off. When you see Shadow Well casting, move. Okay, so the next guy we'll talk about, I'm going to skip ahead of this just a little bit because this poll is essentially the Sorcerers and the Necromancers, which we've already talked about. The Necromancer we're going to talk about in a second. The only thing, I guess I will mention something about Nar'zudah. So if you do Nar'zudah here, he does Necrotic Bolts. So you just want to interrupt those as much as possible, of course. And then he's going to do Death Burst, which is going to spawn all these little swirlies on the floor. They blow up very fast, so you need to move out of the way. And then the last thing he does that's important as a healer is if you have a Purge, so that's Shaman and Priest. And then if you're playing Blood Elf, you can also Purge. Dark Shroud, as soon as it finishes casting, you just want to Purge Nar'zudah. You can see this buff on him. Just somebody with a Purge wants to purge this off, because what it does is it makes him immune to, I believe, physical damage, and then it also pulses for AoE damage to everybody in the group as long as he has the shield. So there you can see I purged it off, and we're all good. This build's a little bit messy, and then we'll go ahead and skip ahead. So next up we have the... oh, actually, I missed a pack back here, so we're going to back up just a little bit. We have the Bonecarver here, so the Zolramus Bonecarver. They just do Bone Flay, and this needs to be stunned or crowd controlled. You can use, I think, anything except a knockback, so like displacement effects won't actually work. You need to use some kind of stun or something that, you know, stops them in some way, like paralysis from monks, stuff like that. And if this cast does go off, it just applies a heavy bleed to the tank. So there you can see, I'm not actually tracking the bleed itself, but now the tank has like a pretty hefty bleed on him. So try to stun those if you can. Otherwise, just heal through the bleed when the tank gets it. And then next up we have the Necromancer that I'll talk about right here. I guess I'll just talk about it while we're here since we're fighting it. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. So the Necromancer has a bunch of adds around him. The adds don't actually take any damage, so you just want to focus the Necromancer. And the Necromancer just does Necrotic Bolt, which you want to watch out for. And then he does Grim Fate, which you can see right here. And what Grim Fate does is it targets a random player. Here it targeted our monk. And they just need to use the defensive and get out of the group. They have like a big green swirly on them that'll do damage to everyone around them after a few seconds. And you'll see here in a second the monk will probably take some damage. There it is. So it pops. So when someone has Grim Fate, keep them nice and healthy. And then after the damage pops, make sure you heal them back up as quickly as possible. And then the last thing that the Necromancer does is Animate Dead, which we should see here in a second. And when Animate Dead happens, we just want to interrupt it with some kind of stun or crowd control. Because, did he not do it, or did we already interrupt it? Maybe we'll see it on the next one. I'll go ahead and fast forward to the next one, and we'll check real quick. So there's Animate Dead right here. It just does a 3-second channel, and it'll spawn new adds. And you want to just crowd control this with a stun in order to stop him from casting it. So there we incapacitate and roared it, and then it stops him from summoning any more adds. So here he only summoned 2 adds. He'll always summon the adds in the same order. It'll always be a warrior, a crossbowman, and then a mage. You mainly just care about the mage spawning, because if another mage spawns, it just makes the pull a lot more difficult. So being able to interrupt that Animate Dead cast is a very good thing. Okay. So next up we have the Marauders. These guys just do a frontal cleave called Gruesome Cleave right here. And that's pretty much all you need to watch out for as a healer, is don't stand in front of them if you're melee, and keep the tank nice and topped off, because they actually take quite a bit of damage from those cleaves. And then they just do a fear that needs to be interrupted. And then the last thing is this Bone Shattering Shield. When you're pulling these 2 Marauders, I guess I'll just mention it since we're already talking about it. When you do these 2 Marauders here, one of them will usually, sometimes they shield at the same time, but other times they'll shield separately. So let's see here if they do it. So like, yeah, see, Star is casting his shield, and Orange is casting a fear. So that means that Star has the shield first. You can see right there, Star has a shield and Orange doesn't. When you kill the shield, the Marauder dies, like in most cases, or at least takes a lot of its health and damage. So because Star shielded here, we should just be single targeting Star and doing... like, no, we shouldn't care at all about Orange, because you just want to hit them when they have the shield active. Like, any damage outside of the shield is pretty irrelevant, because you'll see how much damage they take when we do break the shield here. So we focus Star here, and then they literally both die. And then we just switch to Orange because he's shielded afterwards. So that's just a minor thing. Okay, what else do we have to talk about? Next up is the boss. So we're just going to skip all this stuff because this is all just mobs that we already talked about. And we have the boss here. Cool. So boss is going to spam Necrotic Bolt. I believe it hits random players every time, so you just want to interrupt it as much as possible. Otherwise, again, they take a little bit of damage and they get that healing absorb on them. So keep the group nice and healthy. The main thing as a healer, there is two things that we're going to talk about. Is these ad phases where he spawns different ads, and then we have when the ads blow up and you've killed them all. So essentially, you want to plan your healing cooldowns for each ad, like set of ads. So when the boss is spawning ads, that's when you should be using healing cooldowns. This first set of ads is usually pretty easy because you have Lust going. A lot of people have cooldowns running, so it all dies pretty fast and nothing's really happening. But the main healer thing that a lot of people don't know about this boss is actually after the ads die, so I'll explain it here in a second. And while we're here, just in case there's any questions on it, if you crowd control the mages, you can crowd control them with literally anything, and as long as they are crowd controlled when they die, when the boss blows them up, so here in a second, boss is going to blow all the ads up. This one's still alive, but it's crowd controlled. They will not do damage to the group when they explode. Because normally if an ad is alive and the boss blows it up like this, it's just an instant wipe. But because he has paralysis on him, he blows up, nothing happens. So if there's ever ads alive, for instance, say there were still 2 ads alive under the boss and we didn't kill them yet, and the boss was blowing them up and we're about to wipe, I can just drop, as a shaman, I can just drop a capacitator totem, stun them both right as the cast is going off. So I would stun them like right, I'd wait, and I'd keep waiting. Boss is about to blow them up, I think. Yeah, so here goes. And now I would drop my capacitator totem. Now it would stun the 2 mobs under the boss that are still alive, and then they would be stunned while this cast finishes, and it wouldn't kill us. So if you crowd control them like that, it will not kill your group. So keep in mind for that, because you can always save your group's life like that. Okay, but when the boss does Final Harvest, he is going to gain a little buff. You can barely see it down here on his unit frame. It's this little 5 stack of a buff that has 30 seconds on it. And what this buff does is for every ad that he killed, he gains a aura that does damage to everybody in the group. So you're going to watch here as we're fighting him. We're just taking random damage. Like everybody's in the group just taking unavoidable ticks of damage. And this is what healers, a lot of people, not just healers, but just people in general that do this fight, they don't understand that that's how it works. And that's what's doing damage to you. So then when you're taking all this damage, like the boss still has this buff going for 15 more seconds. So that means we're going to be taking all this damage that we're taking right now, just passively, and the ads are alive doing damage to us. So this is when it's the most dangerous, is when the boss has stacks of this buff and you have ads going. Because this is when you need to be most alert as a healer and like really using healing cooldown. So this is why I would plan a healing cooldown for every ad set after the first. So ad set number 2 and ad set number 3, and if you ever get a 4th, you would also use it there. Just planning like one big healing cooldown for each set of ads is very, very useful. And then also on top of that, so like when this Final Harvest happens, I'm keeping the group nice and healthy. I'm dropping Cloudburst totems. I'm doing stuff like that. I mean, unfortunately, I'm not doing it right now, but you get the idea. Like, you want to be keeping the group healthy the entire time going until the next set of ads. Because if you fall behind, then by the time the ads spawn, your group's just going to die and bleed out, and you're not going to be able to save them. So you got to keep ahead, and then when the ads spawn, you further stay ahead by using healing cooldowns to keep the group topped up. Okay, and now we are going upstairs. The first thing is these spare parts. They just fixate random players, so keep the group healthy. If you stun them or crowd control them, like right there we use a roar, they will stop their fixate and just attack the tank, so that's very helpful to know. I'm going to kind of run through a lot of these mobs very quickly because a lot of them share abilities with mobs that we've seen before, but I'll just kind of re-explain some of those. So the first guy we'll talk about, I guess, is the these guys we don't need to do anything. The creations are literally the vanguards from down below. They just do, the only thing they add is like an AoE right here that you just need to avoid. But otherwise they're the exact same. They just do Bone Claw, and they also don't gain the stacking rage effect, so they're actually way easier to deal with. The next mob we'll talk about is the corpse collectors here. They do throw flesh like we talked about earlier. They do drain fluids like we talked about earlier. The only thing added is that they also do something called gore splatter, which I think happened a little earlier. So we'll watch him here. There's gore splatter. It got interrupted very quickly. If gore splatter goes through, it does a heavy amount of damage to everyone in the group and applies a very, very heavy hitting dot to everybody in the group. And it's like a disease dispel, I think. So you want to make sure that you interrupt gore splatter over pretty much anything else just because of how deadly it is. It's pretty much like on certain key levels, it just becomes an instant wipe if you let a gore splatter go off. So keep in mind of that. Next up, we have in this big pack here, this is all stuff that we've already seen throughout the dungeon. The only thing we need to talk about is the Stitchwerk. So you have the Kyrian Stitchwerk. I'm actually going to fast forward it to where we fight this other one over here. So here's the Kyrian Stitchwerk. What it's going to do, two main abilities, Tenderize and Mutilate. It always alternates between both of them. So here it's doing a Tenderize. It hits the tank, applies a debuff that increases their physical damage taken, I believe, or reduces their armor, either way, but that's pretty much the same thing. And then after Tenderize, it's going to do a Mutilate, and then it'll do a Tenderize again, and then it'll do a Mutilate, and it'll just keep doing that. So basically, just keep the tank healthy for every Mutilate. The Tenderizes don't actually hit very hard, as you can see right there. They mainly just apply a debuff, and then the Mutilates are what actually hit very hard. Here's a Mutilate. You can't see it there because the tank had defensives and an absorb rolling, but the idea is the same. The Mutilates are what are dangerous. The Tenderizes are dangerous in the fact that the debuff is what's making the tank take a lot of extra damage from things. But the Mutilates are what can like literally one-shot your tank if you aren't paying attention to them or keeping the tank healthy. Let's see. Outside of that, we skip all this stuff. These guys are pretty much nothing healer relevant, and they copy a lot of abilities from previous mobs. Goregrind is literally just a Stitchwerk. He just does Tenderize and Mutilate, so don't need to talk about him. This guy is the same, Rotspew, but instead of doing Tenderize, he has two new abilities. He does an aura around him that does damage to everybody. You can see the little debuff here on the tank. This is just anybody in melee. The monk will have it too, now that he is also in melee. It'll just do constant damage to anybody who's near him. So you'll just want to do extra healing to people who are in melee because they're also taking damage from this ability here. And then on top of that, the other new ability that he has instead of Tenderize is this Spew Disease. It targets a random player. Here it's targeting me. You just want to press some kind of defensive and then heal yourself back up and get out of the puddle. And that's pretty much it. The only thing dangerous about this mob is the Mutilate spamming on the tank, obviously, and then the Spew Disease. Like the Spew Disease, if someone isn't healthy, like here I pop my defensive, and then just keep the person, whoever gets targeted by Spew Disease, you should top them up really fast right before it hits, just to make sure, and then also do additional healing after it has hit them. So here it's on the monk, gets very low, and that's because I was letting him get too low here, like I was too fixated on healing other people besides him, and he's sitting here in melee ticking down slowly. Right after here. So here you'll start seeing the monk take a bunch of damage. Right here I should be healing up the tank and not worrying too much about anybody else. Because like right here I'm healing the tank, but I should be healing the monk because he's the one who's actually in danger of dying. The tank isn't going to die from being at 80% health. Okay, and then we have the boss. So we have Surgeon Stitchflesh. The creations, they just do, I believe it's called Mutilate. But if it's not, it's the equivalent to Mutilate. It just hits the tank for a heavy amount of damage. And then Surgeon Stitchflesh, pretty much the exact same thing. He's just going to hit the tank with, what is it called? Sever Flesh, which is just going to do a heavy amount of tank damage. So this fight is all about keeping the tank just as healthy as you possibly can. You really want to spam healing into the tank and just keep them super, super healthy, especially if you don't know them and you don't know if they're going to pop defensives when and where and how and all that stuff. So keep the tank very healthy, and then the only other thing that you need to kind of watch out for is when there's a Stitchflesh's creation active, it does pulsing AoE damage to everybody in the group. So if there's ever a point where there's like 2 or 3 creations alive at a time, the group will start taking a lot of damage, like very, very heavy damage. So you want to be mindful of that. And then the last thing that the boss does is, I don't know if we'll actually see, okay, you can see it here. He's casting it right now. He's casting Stitch Needle. Sorry, I'm like talking so fast. Stitch Needle will just target a random player. Here it's targeting the tank, and it just applies a bleed to them if the cast finishes. And then you just need to watch that player. The bleed doesn't do an insane amount of damage, but it is enough to be, you do need to like keep an eye on it and be ready to heal that player up. So that's pretty much it for this boss. The biggest advice I can really give to people who are coming into this dungeon without overwhelming them is just keep the tank very, very healthy and don't worry too much about anything else. Just spam heal the tank. Because that's how you wipe on this boss, is if the tank dies. If the tank dies, you're wiping. If the tank's alive, the fight should be going relatively smoothly. Okay, and then we have our last boss, Nalthor. I'm not playing my Paladin here, but I will give some tips for some certain healers and stuff. So the first thing is when we pull this boss, we're AFKing for a little while to wait for cooldowns. Let's go ahead and go back to the start. Should be starting here in a second. Okay, so this boss, I'm going to talk about 3 main things. The first one is Frozen Binds. So Frozen Binds will just target a random player, and then they'll get a giant circle around them, and they need to be dispelled. So you can see here, it is on the mage. You can see this giant radius around the mage. If I dispel right away, because myself, and the Druid, the Balanced Druid, we're inside the circle, it will just transfer the debuff to us without the circle. So it'll root us in place, essentially, and that's a very bad thing, because if we're rooted, we will die to the next mechanic that we're going to talk about. Or actually, it's not a mechanic that I had in mind, but anyways, I'll still mention it. So you wait until everyone is outside of the circle, and then you dispel the player. If you're a Holy Paladin, or a Paladin in general, you can hand a Freedom people before they get targeted, or like as they get targeted by the ability. So here we start the fight, and then when the mage, so it says Frozen Binds, and it's telling me who is targeting. It also marks them with a skull if you have big wigs, I believe, or little wigs. You can freedom, so like if I was a Paladin, I could freedom the mage right now, and then when this cast finishes, the debuff wouldn't even apply to the mage, so we wouldn't have to worry about the radius or the circle or anything like that. It would just make them immune to the ability to begin with. So that is a very helpful tip. But if you freedom after the ability is cast, that's why you have to be careful, it will just act as if you dispelled it. So then it will root everybody around the person. So you have to make sure that your timing is good. And the reason that we don't want to be rooted is the Comet Storm. The Comet Storm just does this. You just need to keep yourself moving. If you stand still, the comets kill you. Cool. Easy enough. The next thing we'll talk about is the Icebound Aegis, which should happen here in a minute. You can see it on the Bigwigs timers. This is where your healing cooldowns need to come into play, and this is also where like you need to be most alert as a healer, is when these Icebound Aegises are happening, because what essentially happens is the boss is going to gain a shield. You can barely see it. You can see it a little bit better on his actual unit frame, and until this shield is broken, he's going to do unavoidable AoE damage to everybody who's up here fighting the boss. So you can see, you'll start seeing us take a little bit of damage there. I took a spike of damage, and you can see us all kind of taking a bit of damage until the shield breaks. So there's broken, and now we're not taking any more damage. So it's essentially, during the Icebound Aegis, you want to be healing the group a lot, and then outside of the Icebound Aegis, you want to be healing the tank a lot, because the boss is just going to spam Icy Shards. Typically, when he's in the Aegis, he's not going to Icy Shard the tank, because he's too busy casting other abilities, like sending people downstairs, or doing the Comet Storm. So during the Comet Storm, the tank is completely safe, you don't need to worry about them, but anytime you see the boss spam casting Icy Shard, and there are times where he's casting Icy Shard while having a shield if you don't kill it fast enough, that's when the tank is most in danger. So keep the tank topped up when he's not casting other abilities like Dark Exile and Comet Storm, and then keep the group topped up during the Icebound Aegis. And that is pretty much it for understanding like the tanks, how the tanks take damage in this fight, and how the group takes damage in this fight. So that covers Necrotic Wake. I'm sorry, this one felt like I was talking a little bit too fast and a little bit too much. I don't know if I'm in a hurry or something, but apologies if I skipped over some stuff or if I like made things more complicated than they actually should be. But hopefully this video was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really looking forward to 9.2 and doing a bunch of content in there. So let me know what other kind of content you want to see and stuff. And thanks again. See you later.